We are happy to start this fourth day of our course with the first session, which is dedicated to recent developments in shipping law, with 4 distinguished speakers. 2 will be present here in Dubrovnik and 2 will connect online. One is Professor Vincenzo Martella. I see that he is already connected, and the other is Professor Julia Chagas Lessa from Brazil. And I will give the floor to our chairwoman, Professor Petra Mijelovic, who will announce our first speaker. Please, Petra.
Second try. Good morning to you all. I was given the honor of chairing this first session, recent developments in shipping law. The first presentation will be given by Professor Achim Puetz. Professor Puetz obtained his PhD from University of Castellon, for which he received the Outstanding Doctoral Award. Since September 2018, he has been an Associate Professor of Commercial Law, and he has also lectured master's and PhD degree studies in Spain and abroad. Professor Puetz is the author of the monography and numerous research articles and contributions to collective work. He's currently Vice Dean of the degree in law at in Spain and holds the position of the academic secretary of its Institute for Transport Law in Spain. Today, we will be talking about ship management agreements and ship manager liability. So, Professor Puetz, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for your very kind introduction. As it's been said, I'm going to speak today about ship management agreements. I have the advantage that yesterday we already had a session on ship management, so there are some things you already know. And I would like to focus on issues we didn't speak about yesterday. And I will mainly focus on the legal nature of ship management agreement and some issues related to liability, which yesterday we could not address. So I will give that a short introduction, circumstances of fatal ship management, ship managers today, what do they do? Then I will speak about ship managing the BIMCO form phase, no international convention on ship management. So rules are either to be found in national law or in standardized forms. The most important ones are those of the BIMCO. We speak about duties of the party, legal nature of the contract, and liability of the owner, the ship manager, liability both between the parties and vis-a-vis the force through the parties. If you have time, I would say anything, we can also address some questions about ship management and insurance we didn't hear about yesterday. So, as you were told, under ship management agreement, the ship manager undertakes against the owner, or on behalf of the latter, which is important, the legal and material acts that are deemed to be necessary to adequately administer or some of the aspects involved in the operation of the ship. If you have a close look, this very much resembles what happened in corporate law, because quite some decades ago, there was something we call the managerial revolution, where ownership of the company was separate from control, in the sense that corporate directors started to take over control, and the owners of the companies, the shareholders, well, they were actually the owners, but they did not have control over the company. And the idea of ship management is pretty similar, because we still have an owner, the ship owner, and there's another person, the ship manager, who controls the ship to a greater or lesser degree. So, as I told you before, legal rules on ship management are quite scarce. So the importance of internationally accepted standard forms is very important, and we also looked yesterday that there is the two forms, which is shipment form and the crewman form. I will mainly speak about the shipment form, although I will also make some reference to the crewman forms. In Spain since 2014, we do now have some short rules on ship management, which mainly pick up what scholars had said before about what the ship management agreement is. So I think it's quite a good summary about what the ship manager is supposed to do and which is the liability of the ship manager. Most of these rules would apply in any case because they are just a specific transformation, if you want, of general civil law. But there are some specific rules which really help to solve questions which cannot that easily be addressed by general private law, which is what Massimiliano Musi pointed out yesterday. Since regulation is very short, only some few issues are addressed. The importance of the forms was still undisputed, and the regulation in the Navigation Act is mainly non-mandatory, so party autonomy is still very, very important. Here's the first page of the Shipment 2009 agreement. I mean, it's just standard form you all know. It's this box design where you fill in the box with identification of the owner, of the ship manager, etc. And you can choose. We will talk about that later. You can choose which are the services which are to be provided by the ship manager. You see technical management. I spoke about that yesterday. Crew management, commercial management, and there would still be the insurance management, which did not fit on the slide. So why does or should a ship owner take recourse to ship management? Well, traditionally, there has been quite some reason. The first and original one is the lack of skill on the part of the owner. And this is quite logical if you think that from the 60s, perhaps, or the 70s, there were people or companies who traditionally did not own ships, who started to buy ships and to operate them, but they had no idea how to do it. For example, oil companies started to buy oil tankers, but of course there were no ship owners and they had no idea whatsoever about how to run a ship. Or if a ship is foreclosed by the bank usually does not know how to run a ship either. So it might be interesting to contract a ship manager, or KS companies, say the Scandinavian expression that there are similar companies in company forms in other European countries. In Germany, it would be a limited company, but well, with some of the partners being liable without limit. In Spain, yeah, we have the Sociedad Humanitaria, which is basically this idea. So we have investors who invest into ship, but the only thing they want is to get a return on their investment. So they entrust a ship management to professional ship managers. There's a second reason Juan Pablo talked to us about yesterday. If you have a complex fleet, which we have corporate structure where there are, there's a beneficial owner, if you want, at the top, but there are many companies below which all of them have, one only asset, which is ship, one ship company. Then we have a complex structure. It is possible that all the ships that belong to one fleet are managed by the same ship manager, which frequently is also the company within this group. Related to the mentioned reason, there's also another one which is flat convenient. You know that many of the one ship companies have their domicile abroad in jurisdictions where, let's say, control is not that strict, as in Europe, for example. But if this is so, it is still quite frequent that ship managers, that the management of ships entrusted to manager who's seated in a country with long maritime tradition. We talked about this in dinner 2 days ago, and there was a colleague in Switzerland who said that there are many ship managers in Switzerland. So you can see it's not necessary that the ship manager really is seated at the same place or in the same country as the ship owner. And then there's the last reason, which might also be interesting, which is economies of scale and the experience, of course, in management. I mean, if you have a ship manager who manages 200 ships, perhaps as much, but he will get more experience than a ship owner who may have 3 or 4. And it may also serve for benchmarks. So you have 5 ships, and you say, okay, I will entrust the management of one of them to ship manager to see if he performs better than I do. And so I can see if I'm doing things right or if I am not. According to what we've just talked about, we can classify ship managers according to different criteria. The first criterion would be, would help us to distinguish between between in-house management and third-party ship management. We speak about in-house ship management if the ship manager is the company within the corporate structure of the ship owner, and it would be third-party ship management if there are no corporate relationships between the parties, but only a contractual or a management agreement. We will talk about later. But probably the most important criterion for classification is the one that applies to the services which are entrusted to the manager. I told you before in the definition that a ship management, or by virtue of the ship management agreement, some or all of the services related to the management of the ship are entrusted to a ship manager. Since there's all or some, it's up to the parties to decide which services exactly are entrusted to the ship manager. There are 4 possibilities I've already told you, and these are opt-in provisions. So it's up to the parties to decide which functions are assumed by the manager. First is technical or nautical management, for example, to ensure that vessels comply with the legislation of the flag state with the ISM and ISPS code, to guarantee supply of provisions, spare parts, lubricants, and importantly, if the manager assumes technical or nautical management, he is the company under the ISM and ISPS code. He can also assume crew management. If he only assumes crew management, we frequently speak about a manning agent, which is basically the same ship manager who assumes crew management. Commercial management, we look for employment for the ship. We try to sell the services the ship can provide, basically by concluding contract of carriage, either charter parties or contract or bill of lading contract. And then there is insurance management, where the manager would assume to provide for insurance, mainly of course health and P&I insurance. I will mainly skip this because we do not have much time, but you see this is these are opt-in provisions. You can say yes or no in case the manager does or does not assume technical management, and then the shipment form establishes what are the obligations of the ship manager under technical management. The same is true for crew management, yes or no, to look for employment for the ship, and for insurance management. Okay, mosquito. So let's get to the interesting part, which is the duties of the parties, which should allow us to determine the legal nature of a ship management contract, because only we know its legal nature, we can determine whether there's a breach and when there is none. So if we have to first look at the duties of the manager, but of course his or her obligations depend on which other services he has promised to provide, actually through commercial and or insurance money. Well, the most important, probably the most important obligation of the ship manager is to act on behalf and in the name of the owner. We spoke about this yesterday too. To act on behalf and in the name of the manager means that if the manager concludes a contract, the parties to this contract are the owner and the third party. So the manager is not party to these contracts. And if there's a breach, the third party would have to file a claim against the owner and not against the manager. So this clearly is an agency relationship. The manager is not a party to the contract he concludes on behalf and in the name of the owner. With one exception. If we opt for crew management under the crewman B form, the situation is different because in this case, it is the manager who contracts with the crew. So the manager in this case is the employer of the crew, and he just puts this crew on the ship of the owner. In this case, since he is the employer, the employment contract are of course celebrated in his own name, and if there's any kind of breach, it would be the ship manager who would be held liable. As regards the scope of his authority, of course, he has to have authority, power. If not, it would be impossible to act on behalf of and in the name of the owner. Well, the form says that he has or should have sufficient authority for all those acts that the manager deems necessary in each case to comply with the agreement, and to do so in accordance with sanction of crew management practice. And as you see in clause 3, he has absolute discretion to decide which acts he should perform to comply with his service. Then, of course, he has duties of diligence and, of course, loyalty. There is an agency relationship behind, so the manager has to act loyally towards the owner. Yesterday, Albano told us that he does not promise a result. He promises an activity that it is just a due diligence obligation. It is not an or best effort obligation. It's not an absolute obligation. So if the result is not achieved, not necessarily the manager can be held liable. He has to use his best efforts, and well, the English courts tend to interpret this in quite a strict way. It is best efforts, it's not second best or third best efforts. He has to employ his best efforts to achieve the result, but if it is not achieved, well, there is no problem unless there is negligence on the part of the ship owner. And there are some ancillary obligations. I will not stop to speak about this, well, yes, of course, to justify income and expense. On the other side, as regards the owner, the primary obligation is, of course, to pay the manager. And there are two possibilities. There is cost plus fee, and the cost plus fee or lump sum, depending on the form the parties choose. If it is cost plus fee, then well, the manager receives reimbursement of all the costs he incurred to comply with the service. If it is lump sum, well, he's paid a lump sum in advance, and well, he assumes himself the expensive sum unless there is an extraordinary expense which is not emphasized by the contract. So in the first And the first version, cost plus fee, well, the manager already knows which is his benefit, which is the fee. And in the second case, it depends on the expenses he has to make. The less he spends, the more he gains. There are also ancillary obligations. Well, depends on which are the obligations assumed by the manager. And this leads us to the important question, which is the legal nature of the contract, where we have been speaking quite some time about management services. So of course, the first idea we might have is that it is a contract for services. But we can also think that it is a mere agency relationship. And I think this is the better option. As a general rule, the manager assumes one or more. We've already seen this. Best asset obligations. There are some absolute obligations, but there are very few. Best asset obligations. And he mainly promises to conclude legal acts on behalf and in the name of the owner. Whenever a person promises to perform legal acts on behalf of or in the name of the owner, it is a contract of collaboration between businessmen rather than a contract for services. It is an agency relationship. And this is also the solution which has been adopted under the Maritime Navigation Act, which says that if there is a gap in legislation or the parties have not addressed the specific question, so we would have to go to agency contracts or a legal regulation of agency contract. But which one? I mean, there are two. There is the commission agent and there are commercial agents. So this depends on the duration of the contract. If it is a long-term relationship, then we would apply, in case of a gap, we would apply the regulation on commercial agency. And if it is just a short-term relationship, we would apply the regulation on commission agent. I think that something we can reach this same conclusion under Italian law. For example, I took a quote from the Codice Civile, which says that il mandato è il contratto col quale una parte si obbliga a compiere uno o più atti giuridici per conto dell'altra, which is exactly what ship management is about: to conclude contracts or legal acts or acts with legal consequences for the owner in his name and on his behalf. While, as regarding the contratto di agenzia, it says that for contratto di agenzia una parte assume stabilmente, and this is the big difference, stabilmente l'incarico di promuovere per conto dell'altra verso la retribuzione la conclusione di contratti in una zona determinata. So the difference between one and the other legal regime would be the duration. On a stable basis, we would apply the agency and the commercial agency regulation. If it's just a sporadic relation, we would move on to the commission agent. And this helps us to determine which is the liability regime between the parties and also against third parties. If you have a first look at liability between the parties, the manager is liable, well, when he does not fulfill his functions, when there is a breach of the contract. So when is there a breach? There are some rules in the shipment form. Yesterday, I think we spoke about clause 17. Clause 17 excludes liability of the manager where there is force majeure. It's a general rule of private law, so we do not have to. We do not have to focus on this. I mean, Spanish commercial code is the same. The agent, the manager in this case, who without legal cause, if there is no ground to believe, does not comply with the commission, well, incurs in liability. Then clause 17 also limits the maximum amount of the compensation you will receive this now, and it provides a Himalaya clause in favor of the manager's agents. And currently, no Himalaya clause mainly says that in case there is liability, and we ask compensation from the agents and servants of the debtor, well, they can avail themselves of the limitations and liability established in this case in the shipman form. And with respect to the best effort obligations, of course, there is a breach when the debtor does not observe due diligence, which would be this sound management practice, or in the Spanish case, that's an orderly businessman. And here you have clause 14, you see that prejudice subclause 17a, the manager shall be under no liability whatsoever to the owners for any law damage delayed, whatever. And however, arising in the course of performance of management services, unless same is proved to have resulted solely from the negligence, gross negligence, or willful default of the managers or their employees or agents subcontractors by them in connection with the busting. When do we have negligence? Well, when the manager does not observe due diligence. So in these cases, the managers would be held liable. And then there's this limitation clause which says that the manager's liability for each incident, a series of incidents giving rise to claim or claims, shall never exceed a total of 10 times the annual management fee payable hereunder. As you know, as a private law, it's perfectly possible to limit the liability of the parties in case of default, unless probably when there's willful misconduct, which is what clause 17 also says. So as regards the liability of the owner, the limit of the ship owner's liability is of course also force majeure, and then well, there's a special rule which is quite logical, a special rule for delay in the payment of the fee or expenses. In this case, the consequence is also logical. The ship owner would have to pay an interest in favor of the manager. And then the BIMCO also includes an indemnity clause. You will also know this from other maritime contracts, which mainly say that in the event that the manager is held liable for an act made on behalf of the ship owner, which he should not, because the act is as an agent only. But if he is held liable, he may ask for reimbursement from the ship owner, for the expenses he had to incur for the damages he has had to pay. But then again, this is not a new rule. We can find this same rule under traditional private law codes, Spanish commercial code, for example, safeguards the manager's action against the principal where he's acted in his own name, or the Article 1720 of the Codice Civile, of the Codice Civile. So the clause says that the owners should undertake to keep the managers and their employees, agents, and subcontractors indemnified and to hold them harmless against all active proceedings, claims, demands, or liability whatsoever arising out of the performance of the ship management agreement. I think I have some 5 minutes left. I will then move on to liability between third parties, and of course here we have to talk about liability in contract and liability in tort, which are completely different situations. If you have a look at liability in contract, then clause 3 of the shipment, we've already seen this, obliges to the manager to act as an agent and on behalf and in the name of the ship owner. This, to me, does not look like an obligation in a strict legal sense, because the failure to fulfill this obligation, I think it does not give rise to damages the manager would have to pay to the ship owner. But we could call it perhaps a burden, in the sense that if the manager does not comply with his duty or burden to contract on behalf and in the name of the ship owner, he will suffer a negative consequence, which is that, well, he will be a party to the contract celebrated with the third party. And in case there is a breach, he will be claimed for damages. However, since it is a general rule of private law, shipment is not established which are the consequences in case the agent really acts on behalf of and in the name of the ship owner. Because of course, if he does so, then the third party is bound only to the ship owner, if the manager acts as an agent only, is bound to the only to the ship owner and has no action against the ship manager, which, as I told you, is a general rule of private law. So you can find it both in the Quality Civil and in the Spanish Commercial Code. I'm sorry not to mention the Croatian legislation, but my Croatians are worse than Italian, so I fear that you will have to manage with Italian. So, if the manager makes it clear, and this is a rule which might be necessary, if the manager makes it clear that he acts as agent only, alieno nomine, in the name of someone, but he does not indicate who is his principal. He does not say who is the ship owner. Right? He is liable, but the undisclosed principal. Well, I say, okay, I'm acting as an agent only, but for who? I don't know. So in this case, the ship manager is liable. This perhaps cannot be found in civil code. So the Spanish Navigation Act says this specifically. I think it's not necessary to mutate, but anyway, it is there, and perhaps it's an important rule just for classification. But when the manager acts in his own name, then he should be considered a party to the contract. So if there's a breach, the third party can address him directly. But what the Maritime Navigation Act says is that he's jointly and severally liable together with the ship owner. This is a rule which cannot so easily be derived from traditional civil or commercial codes. So it is specified specifically in the Maritime Navigation Act. But probably you could read a similar solution, at least under Spanish law. This solution had already been achieved much before, but for the sake of clarification, the Maritime Navigation Act says that, okay, in this case, there's joint and several liability, although the third party possibly does not even know who's the principal because the manager has acted in his own name. And then there's liability in tort, where of course the third party does not enter into negotiation, into contractual relationship, either with the ship manager or the ship owner, so here the rules necessarily have to be different. What the Navigation Act says that is that in this case, the ship owner and the manager are jointly and severally liable to the third party, which is also just a clarification of general private law. Because if you have, well, you could perhaps look at labor law, if you have an employer, you have an employee, and the employee causes damage to the third party, extra contractually, you can either claim against the employee or you can claim against the employer whenever the employee acted in the exercise of his function. This is basically the same. So both are jointly and severally liable, which is it's a solution to protect the interest of the third party who involuntarily, without entering into the contractual relationship, suffered the damage and has a claim against either the manager or the owner. And nonetheless, the owner, should not be held liable where the harmful event is not attributable to the manager in the first place, because this is not a rule of liability, this is a rule of attribution of liability. If the manager is not liable, then the ship owner cannot be held severally and jointly liable because there's no liability in the first place. This is a solution we can find, for example, in the Bunker Convention, We can also think that perhaps when a manager acts completely outside the scope of his functions, then the ship owner will not be held liable, which is a solution under transport conventions, where the agent, the driver, for example, the driver basically acts completely outside the scope of his functions, then the carrier will not be held liable. So possibly we could also reach a similar conclusion here. And we can also pose the question the other way round. Article 318 of the Maritime Navigation Code says that in case there is an extra-contractual or tort damage towards the third party, ship manager and owner are jointly and severally liable. So this may also mean that when it's the ship owner who's liable in the first place, we might think we can file a claim against the ship owner. But of course, this can only be the case where default or when negligence is on part of the ship owner, but on the part of the manager, sorry, but the person who's held liable is the ship owner, which happens under the CLC convention. Then whoever caused physical damage, it will always be the ship owner who is held liable for the solution damage which has been caused. But then again, CLC convention itself says that what channels liability towards the ship owner and prohibits to file a claim against the ship manager, and then of course they will misconduct. So to finish, well, none of what we talked about limits the rights of either the ship manager or the ship owner to limit the liability under the London Convention on limitation of maritime claims. So there are many more questions you might press. If you have something you would like to ask, you can perhaps wait for the plug in. And I would once again like to thank